All right. Had a break, and we're going to get started on the next panel. All right. So the purpose of the article that I submitted with Chris Famagetti was to address generational trends in homeownership, and particularly racial disparities in homeownership across generations. So we know that we had this Great Recession, and we also have this daunting racial wealth gap, where the typical black household has about 10 cents on the dollar as every white household. We know that education is not the panacea for this racial wealth gap. We know that black head of households that have a college degree live in families with less wealth than comparable white households where the head dropped out of high school. We also know from the Great Recession that there was a massive reduction in American wealth by the tune of 40%, and about $50,000 at the median. And this reduction was largely attributed to a loss in home equity. Okay? And black households were hit especially hard. Some people give the narrative that the Great Recession wiped away black wealth. I'm not so sure that that's the correct narrative, because it's not as if blacks have ever had wealth en masse. Whatever wealth they might have accumulated was pretty much decimated after the Great Recession. So we're going to compare millennials, housing, and race, and we're going to look at an early investment in a home, and why is a home particular. Many Americans store their wealth in the form of a home, and the sooner you get into it, given the compounding nature of wealth, perhaps the greater amount of asset security you can have over your life, and the greatest position you are in to accumulate wealth in a compounded way over your life. So we wanted to look at young adults. So we're going to look at people from these generations, the greatest generation, the silent generation, baby boomers, Generation X, and millennials, when they're in the age bracket primarily of 20 to 29. All right. I wish I could move around because I can't see this little tiny graph. I'm looking over here, but I'm going to pull it up on my iPad. Good thing I have this here. Give me 1 second. I am Mike. I can move around. Oh, you know what? Get away from that podium. All right. All right, this graph is allowing us to look across generation and age brackets at not only home ownership rates for blacks and whites, but the white advantage in home ownership. And we know generally at every age level, whites have more home ownership, greater rates of home ownership than blacks. And at the younger generation, it is basically whites have more than twice as likely to own a home compared to blacks. So for example, 20 to 29-year-olds in 2010 for millennials, we could see a white advantage of 2.74. So they were nearly 200% more nearly 300% more likely to own a home compared to a black person. All right, and we can look across generations, and we see that millennials are not doing well. In the aftermath of the Great Recessions, millennials are doing worse than every other generation, going back at least 100 years. You'd have to go back to the greatest generation when they were entering their adulthood right after the Great Depression to find a generation with lower home ownership rates. Okay. And then if we look at the white advantage, so not only are millennials doing worse than previous generations, racial disparity for these young adults are at their all-time high from data that we can track. So if you look at the top box that's shaded red, that number I cited previously of 2.74, that indicates a greater disparity compared to any other generation all the way back to at least the greatest generation. So it's not a happy story. All right. And then this table allows us to look at the aftermath of the Great Recession. So we can see, looking at the Great Recession, if we compare Generation X before the Great Recession, so in 2000, 20 to 29-year-olds, black and white, we can see that black household home ownership rates were 16.5%, in comparison to whites, 34.4%. And then after the Great Recession, we can see that for millennials, in comparison to Generation X, blacks had a loss of about 4.6 percentage points, or 40% loss in rate, compared to whites, Generation X to millennials, of about 1.7 percentage points, or 5%. So there was a loss across both blacks and whites, but it was a steeper loss for blacks and likelihood to own a home. And then, we could talk about some policies that were going on during this time period. We know that banks became more stringent in criteria by which you could acquire a home. We know that the lead up to the Great Recession, there were some policies put in addition to some predatory lending. There were some policies put in place that were intended to promote home ownership as well. So I think this thing is moving and not me. All right, so let's look at our sordid history of racial discrimination in housing and wealth. We can go as far back to the founding of our country to see that we began with chattel slavery when blacks were literally property assets for a white plantation-owning class. There was white capping, where we had terror, white vigilante, violence to steal black property and other assets. There was a system of sharecropping and a Jim Crow South. Then we had a period in which we've had federal policies aimed at promoting asset development that was done in, sorry for the typos, in racially disparate and discriminatory ways by both design and implementation. So we had FHA, we had the GI Bill, which offered many Americans capital to purchase a home, as well as some instruments to get a loan so that they can have a home. But by design, the policies excluded certain individuals based on occupations, and also they were administered at local levels, and with blacks primarily residing in a Jim Crow South, they were not implemented in a racially fair way. And also the bill prevented federal government from trying to identify and prosecute racial discrimination. So this is both by design and implementation that we had, I must have it on an automatic timer because I'm not moving it, that we had a scenario where, as Ira Katz-Nelson, the historian, describes, we had a buildup of a white asset-based middle class, but it was done in a way that excluded blacks. And then we had some progress during the civil rights era. There was the Fair Housing Act. And then after the immediate aftermath of the civil rights, we had equal opportunity. We had the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, we had HMDA, and we had the Community Reinvestment Act. So these were all aimed at providing a more fair access to home ownership and assets and credit in general, and also in promoting black home ownership to some extent. And then more recently, leading up to the Great Recession, we had examples of banks targeting certain groups. We all might recall Wells Fargo with their mud peoples fiasco. We had the foreclosure crisis, and then we have gentrification going on now, where primarily black neighborhoods are now vulnerable in urban areas to a gentry coming in to take advantage of some of the amenities that are offered from urban living. We also have student loan debt, which is going to be discussed later, which for black individuals that actually go to college, they are more likely to end up with debt and end up with higher levels of debt, which also might inhibit their ability to acquire home ownership. Okay, so then this graph, this figure, allows us to look at generations across age brackets. Of course, for millennials, they are not old enough for us to collect much information beyond the age range of 30 to 36. But we can see that this is looking at black-white disparities across generations. And we can see from these trend lines that the millennials' disparity between blacks and whites is larger than any other generation. We can also see some progress, albeit not big. But if we look at the green and the gray lines, those represent Generation X as well as the baby boomers, and they would have benefited from some of the policies that I mentioned before. And you can see that the ratio of black to white disparity for those 20 to 29 is still more than double. But nonetheless, there's some progress relative to prior generations, both the greatest generation as well as the silent generation, and some progress in relationship to where we are now with millennials, albeit small. Okay. All right, so what can we do? If you ask me, the most parsimonious, the most just, and the most direct way to address our sordid history of racial discrimination in housing and wealth would be a systematic program of reparations. And that would entail an authentic analysis, articulation of how we got here and why we are here, and understanding that wealth is very intergenerational, and in the American context, very much tied to home ownership. So we need that not only acknowledgement, that apology, but an apology would be empty if there's no redress. So we would need some redress, restitution, and restoration beyond just a check, although there's some benefits to the symbolism of offering cash without conditions. But the reality is that a population would remain vulnerable if they largely don't have access to the means of production or access to some capital in the form of land. So the redress should include some access to either home ownership or means of production, and then we could have closure as a nation with regards to our original sin of race. Other policies that we can do until America is ready for that reconciliation and that policy implementation, which I think I don't believe it's pie in the sky. I actually think we can get there. But there's also universal race-conscious programs to provide seed capital and other pathways to home ownership and asset security, modeled similarly on the New Deal and post-war policies that generated a white asset-based middle class in the first place. Not only would it benefit whites, it would benefit blacks, and if we are doing it in a race-conscious way, kind of in reverse to how we did it in a race-conscious way in the original New Deal, but in a race-conscious way to ensure that we have race inclusion, gender inclusion, by both the targets of who is eligible and the outcomes by which we are most disparate on those demographic conditions, then we could have a better, more inclusive, just society that provides a pathway for asset security for everyone. And then I think I'm close to out of time. I'm not sure how much time I have. Got 2 minutes. Baby bonds is, there are lots of programs being offered by many politicians right now. There's Elizabeth Warren's housing bill. There's proposals about student loan debt reduction to try to provide more assets. One that Cory Booker is promoting is baby bonds, which I've had a lot of input in its development, and that would provide a birthright to capital to everyone at birth that would be progressively endowed based on the wealth position that you're born into. And in a counterintuitive way, it's intended to divorce you from your family circumstance. In other words, the money would be managed in a federal trust account and available to young adults as some seed capital to put them in a vehicle that will provide some savings and asset security in a passive way, like a home as opposed to renting, like a debt-free college education that might put you in a job that provides asset security through pensions, or like some seed capital to start a business. In other words, why don't we provide a birthright so that everyone has access to capital, not just those that are wealthy? Thank you.